Hello everyone. In this video we will practice reconstructing short arguments, and we're going to use some of the tools and techniques that we learned in the previous video on reconstructing arguments. It'll be helpful if you have a pencil and paper handy so that you can practice along with me when I ask you to pause the video. Let's get started with our first example. Women in the entertainment industry are just as talented and hardworking as their male counterparts, so they should be paid the same. Why don't you hit pause on this video and see if you can identify the stated premise and the stated conclusion and set them up in a standard form argument reconstruction. Hit pause and give that a try before resuming the video. If we look closely, we'll notice that this argument, this little brief argument, does include a conclusion indicator word, and that's the word so after the comma. If we take that as our starting point, we could at the very least separate the stated premise from the stated conclusion. And if we put them in standard form, it would look like this. Premise 1, women in the entertainment industry are just as talented and hardworking as their male counterparts. Hence, women in the entertainment industry should be paid the same as their male counterparts. Now, there is a missing premise or a suppressed premise. It's not stated, but it is doing some work. See if you can identify what additional premise, and it'll be a generalization, is needed to basically connect the premise to the conclusion. Hit pause on this video and come up with an idea before resuming. There would be different ways of wording this generalization, but I think that this is a pretty clear one. Premise 2, people who are equally talented and hardworking should be paid the same. Now, there may be many assumptions behind this argument. For instance, that women are paid less than men in the entertainment industry. That's certainly an assumption. That's part of the reason this argument is being presented, but it's not necessarily part of the logic of the argument. So what I mean by that is, in this case, we do have, and we can sort of use what we've learned from categorical syllogisms to see this. What we have is our stated premise mentions that women are just as talented and hardworking as their male counterparts, and it concludes that they should be paid the same. So what we need is a generalization linking those two properties or characteristics, and that's what we see in premise 2. Women in the entertainment industry are just as talented and hardworking as their male counterparts. People who are equally talented and hardworking should be paid the same. Therefore, women in the entertainment industry should be paid the same as their male counterparts. Notice that the premise 2 links the characteristic of being equally talented and hardworking with the characteristic mentioned in the conclusion that these people should be paid the same. When we state the missing premise like this, it's a universal generalization. It's talking about all people. And when we put the premise in the form of a universal generalization, the upshot is that this is a deductively valid argument. We've reconstructed this argument in a way that makes it deductively valid. Let's look at the next example. Tim's identical twin brother Tom is intelligent and charming, so it's safe to conclude that Tim is intelligent and charming as well. Once again, I'd like for you to hit pause on this video and see if you can separate the stated premise from the stated conclusion and set them up in standard form. Hit pause now and resume the video when you're ready. We can rely on, again, conclusion indicator words. This time it uses the word so again, but also the word conclude. So it's safe to conclude tells us that Tim is intelligent and charming is the conclusion. We take that as our guide then we can set up this much of the argument. Premise 1, Tim's identical twin brother Tom is intelligent and charming, hence Tim is intelligent and charming as well. Now, again, this inference, this move from the stated premise to the conclusion relies on an unstated assumption. So why don't you hit pause on this video and try to come up with an idea about what kind of generalization is needed there. Hit pause and then resume when you're ready. Once again, there are many ways of stating the suppressed generalization, but here's one way to do it. Premise 2, identical twins tend to be very similar in terms of intelligence and personality. Okay? So we get the fact that Tom is intelligent and charming provides us with evidence that Tim is intelligent and charming because they're identical twins, and identical twins tend to be similar in these respects. I want to draw your attention to the fact that this generalization is a statistical generalization and it is not a universal generalization. Think about for a moment, why is that? Why should we opt for a statistical generalization here instead of a universal generalization? The reason is that if we had placed in here a universal generalization, all sets of identical twins are similar in terms of intelligence and personality. It's simply a false assumption. There's, I'm sure, many sets of identical twins who are really, really different from one another in terms of intelligence and personality for various reasons. The premise we've supplied here expresses a general tendency, and that makes it a statistical generalization. By the way, because of that, it means that the inference from the two premises to the conclusion is at best inductively strong. It is not a deductively valid argument. Both of those premises could very well be true and the conclusion false. However, given the tendency and assuming no other counter evidence, this move is inductively strong. Let's look at a third example. And this one comes from Salmon's textbook. She has a slew of arguments for and against marijuana legalization. Marijuana should not be legal since it leads to the use of harder drugs, such as heroin. Once again, I'm going to ask you to pause the video, come up with an argument reconstruction, or at least a start to an argument reconstruction that puts the stated premise and stated conclusion in standard form. Hit pause now and resume when you're ready. Always good to start by looking for those indicator words, and we have one here in the middle, since. Since is a premise indicator word and introduces evidence. And so that indicates that we should at least start our argument reconstruction this way. Premise 1, marijuana leads to the use of harder drugs such as heroin, and the conclusion is that marijuana should not be legal. Now, we want to fill this argument in. Once again, there are some unstated assumptions, and we need to make those unstated assumptions explicit. So why don't you hit pause now and come up with an idea for some unstated premise or premises that will link premise 1 to the conclusion. As always, there's more than one way to do this because you can express the same idea using different wording, but here's a good way to get going. We are assuming something like premise 2. Any drug that leads to the use of harder drugs should not be legal. We're also assuming, by the way, that marijuana is a drug. And that premise is needed because of the way I worded premise 2. So here's how the argument now reads. Marijuana leads to the use of harder drugs such as heroin. Any drug that leads to the use of harder drugs should not be legal. Marijuana is a drug. And so together, those three assumptions together lead to the conclusion that marijuana should not be legal. Once again, let's take a look at why something like premise 2 is going to help us. Look at the stated premise, again, premise 1. It mentions that marijuana leads to the use of harder drugs, and the conclusion is that marijuana should not be legal. Notice that that is exactly what the two characteristics that premise 2 links. Any drug that leads to the use of harder drugs, which is mentioned in the first premise, should not be legal, which is mentioned in the conclusion, right? We actually could think of this as completing the set of three class terms, right? So premise 1 mentions marijuana leading to the use of harder drugs. The conclusion mentions marijuana not being legal. And then the premise, the missing premise, the main missing premise, premise 2, connects leading to the use of harder drugs with not being legal. Okay? So I would also point out that the premise 2 is a universal generalization. And you can, I hope, see this by eyeballing it. That choice of making that a universal generalization renders this argument deductively valid. Okay, let's look at one last short argument together. Given that Kevin is about to graduate from Hanover College, he'll either have a full-time job or be enrolled in graduate school within the next 7 months. Once again, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and put this argument, in at least the stated bits of this argument, in standard form. Separate the premise from the conclusion, and then when you're ready, resume the video. Let's begin by looking for any premise or conclusion indicator words, and we do have one. Given that. Given that is a premise indicator word. It's the starting point of an inference. So given that that's our premise, here's how we would put the argument in standard form, at least the parts that are explicitly stated. Premise 1, Kevin's about to graduate from Hanover College. Conclusion, Kevin will either have a full-time job or be enrolled in graduate school within the next 7 months. So now, again, I hope you feel that there's been a step taken here. There's been an assumption made. Can you state that assumption that will link the evidence presented in the first premise to the stated conclusion? And again, there will be some leeway in terms of wording, but you want to make sure you capture at least something close to what's necessary for this premise to logically support the stated conclusion. Go ahead and hit pause and at least come up with an idea before resuming the video. Okay, so again, wording can vary somewhat, but something like the following has been assumed. Most Hanover College graduates have full-time jobs or are enrolled in graduate school within 7 months of graduation. This generalization, by the way, is true. The percentage is very high. It's over 95%. But we can't know that simply by watching this inference. We do know that the person presenting this argument must be assuming something like this premise, though. Most Hanover College graduates have full-time jobs or are enrolled in graduate school within 7 months of graduation. Once again, we can look at the characteristics or traits or properties or classes mentioned in the stated premise and the stated conclusion to help us come up with this missing premise. What's mentioned in the first premise is that Kevin's about to graduate from Hanover, and that was supposed to lead us to believe that he is either going to have a full-time job or be enrolled in graduate school within 7 months. And that's exactly what our conclusion does. It says Hanover College graduates have full-time jobs or are enrolled in graduate school within 7 months. You may also notice that we've got this term most, which makes premise 2 a statistical generalization. I'd mentioned earlier that the statistics are actually greater than 95%. I think they might actually be 99% over the past 10 or 15 years. So why? Why use a statistical generalization here? Why not use a universal generalization? Hopefully it's pretty obvious. Despite a very solid track record of Hanover College graduates, it's not 100%. Probably no university has 100% job placement or grad school placement record. So we don't want to put in here an assumption that's simply false, right? That's the principle of charity. We don't want to attribute to someone a false premise or faulty reasoning or fallacious reasoning if we can possibly help it. So we are kind of forced to provide a statistical generalization here, and that isn't a bad thing because it means that the argument is still inductively strong. Okay, it's just not deductively valid. Kevin could be, one out of 100 or 1 out of 200 or whatever it is who doesn't land a job or get into graduate school within the first 7 months of graduation. Okay, so those 4 little arguments, very short little arguments, but as you can see, if we really want to analyze those arguments carefully, it does take some work. We need to separate the premises from the conclusions, and we need to find any gaps in the reasoning that need to be filled in with suppressed or unstated assumptions that it's our obligation to state explicitly. And we'll always have the choice in those cases whether we need to supply a universal generalization or a statistical generalization. And we'll be guided in making that choice by the principle of charity, which tells us to reconstruct somebody else's argument in its strongest, most plausible form by avoiding attributing false premises or faulty reasoning to that person.